we do them online, so I guess it doesn't really matter where we do them. Usually on gender and sexuality, general diversity. And I really love my job. I love the work that I do, and I'm really excited to share some of my presentation with all of you. So first things first, whenever I introduce myself, I like to do a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is one of the 96 things that we can do as part of the recommended Truth and Reconciliation tasks. And something that I've learned in my own life is that it's also an appropriate way to introduce yourself, is to explain the territory that you live on, the history that you have, the factors and influences that allow you to do the work that you do and the life that you lead. So I invite you to take a minute to think of something that you're grateful for that allows you to be here today. I am also grateful for the Algonquin Anishinaabe, who are the people who take care of the territory that I've lived on for a big chunk of my life. I'm also really grateful for the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet, who have taken care of the land that my family lives on in New Brunswick since long before my ancestors got here, and probably long after my ancestors die out, realistically. So my name is Eliot. I mentioned I work for the CCGSD. My pronouns are they and them. I'm the education coordinator at the CCGSD. As mentioned, I do a lot of workshops like this around the country. That's kind of my jam. I also provide feedback, policy analysis, kind of whatever we get asked to do over at the charity there. I'm also a trans person, so if you think you've never met one, allow me to disabuse you of that notion. Hi, my name's Eliot. You can ask me kind of whatever you want about my experiences as a trans person, because I would really prefer that you ask me these questions rather than colleagues that you're going to have in the future, friends that you have in your life right now, family members, people you want to maintain a positive relationship with. Just get all those weird and uncomfortable questions out of your system with me, and it'll make your relationships with other people better. But today I will be focusing largely on how you can incorporate 2S LGBTQ folks into whatever your teachable subjects are. One of the things that I am super passionate about as an educator is not getting invited to grade 9 gym. or grade 9 health class. Not that I have anything against grade 9 health class, particularly just that I think people who are part of diverse communities exist in a lot of scenarios outside of, having sex, who they're having it with, who they want to have it with. And I'm really interested in normalizing the inclusion of diverse people in a variety of subjects. And since my BA is in social studies, I did my BA in history at the University of Ottawa. This is kind of my area of specialty, but I am able to speak a little bit to some other topics if you happen to not be pursuing an arts-based course as your teachables. So first up, why have an inclusive curriculum? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Having an inclusive curriculum is one of the strongest predictors of student feelings of safety at school. Something that we know in terms of child development is that it's really important for children and youth to see themselves reflected in media. And that's both in terms of education and, just the things they're watching on TV. I'm sure we've all seen those viral videos of, the first time a small child of color sees, a superhero of color and says, "Mom or Dad, like they look like me. That's me. I could do that." And we've all probably cried about it because it's beautiful when that happens. And we want that to be the norm. We want kids to feel like they're represented in anything that we are teaching them, whether that's specific teachable subjects or the life skills that we're also focusing on. And I want to say too, that one of the things that I think is really important about this is it's not just beneficial for students who are part of the curriculum. Having a diverse and inclusive curriculum benefits everybody because it works on developing understanding, teaching empathy, a lot of the skills that we need to get along with people who are different from us in the real world come from having these curriculum topics that are different from the experiences that a lot of our students are having. There's a concept for curriculum called the window and mirror theory, which was published by Emily Stile in 1996. And the concept of the window and mirror theory is that you want all of your curriculum to fit into sort of two groupings. You either want it to be a window to an experience that your students have not had. So you want them to be able to look through and see things that they don't experience in their day-to-day life. Or you want your curriculum to be a mirror. You want it to reflect to those students that the experiences that they're having are valid, that they're normal, that their identity is, meaningful and correct, not, not even necessarily that it has to be positive, just that it's normal, that it exists. The bar is so low for making diverse students feel comfortable, folks. So we really want your curriculum to sort of fit into this window or mirror category, and you do want both. So you don't necessarily want your curriculum to only ever be sort of peering into experiences that we don't have. You don't want your curriculum to only ever be reflections of experience that the students have themselves. You really want it to be a mixture of experiences, because again, this really helps with things like critical thinking, developing empathy, working on relationships with other people. One of the other reasons that we really want to push for an inclusive curriculum is because GSAs are not the only measure of inclusivity and diversity in a school. We often, when I visit schools or when I talk to teachers and I ask them, what's your school like? What's the climate like there? The first thing they'll tell me is, oh, well, we have a GSA, or we don't have a GSA, but we want a GSA, or we don't have a GSA and we think that's never going to happen. Listen, GSAs are great. I love visiting them. They're one of my favorite workshops to do, because the kids are so passionate and so excited and just so happy to see another queer person like living their life. But not everybody is able to go to GSA. Not everybody wants to go to GSA. Not all the people who need to learn respect for diversity and inclusion are the kind of people who are going to show up in a GSA. So it's really important that our curriculum is diverse across the board, not just, for students who are looking for this information or seeking validation. It's important to have diverse curriculum for everybody. And this also helps, as a side bonus, those of you who are in the community who are looking to become teachers, you will be more comfortable at work if your identity and your experiences are normalized as part of the educational content that is out there. So that's why we should do inclusive curriculum. The problem now is, well, how? So in some schools, 2S LGBTQ topics are restricted. As much as I would love to believe that everybody is teaching in downtown Toronto, that is not the case. A really significant proportion of Canada is rural. Some of you may end up teaching in other places as well. There are countries around the world where it's still completely illegal to be gay or to be trans. There are countries around the world where that is an offense punishable by death. I am never, ever, ever going to go to Russia, for example. And so, whether you're teaching here in the States or abroad, there are going to be situations where 2S LGBTQ topics are likely restricted. And that means that you as a teacher don't have the tools necessary for building or teaching diverse curriculum. And there's a lot of fear around how you can do that safely. Whether you're doing it properly, what if you teach something that's incorrect or inaccurate, something that's wrong, what if you use language that's outdated? There's a lot of concerns and a lot of risks involved in teaching inclusive curriculum. And at the end of the day, diversifying curriculum does mean taking a risk. It means you have to take a risk in particular areas where gender and sexuality are discouraged or straight up restricted. But we're going to talk about how that's not a blanket reason why you can't do anything productive for students in these climates. So the general concept that I'm going to be delving into in this short session is talking about subtle inclusion versus overt inclusion, because I think there's this misconception that if you're going to be teaching diversity, that you have to be devoting entire sessions of your day or entire sessions of your term, a special lecture on Black history or that kind of thing. What I actually want to sort of encourage you to move towards is a model that prioritizes normalization over tokenization. So I want you to include queer and trans, and for that matter, diverse in other ways, right? So, diverse relationships, diverse races, diverse religions, whatever examples you're using. I want you to space them out across your learning. It's not actually really great pedagogy to have a specific module where today is the day we're going to talk about the special people and we're never going to speak about them again. That doesn't make people feel included. It doesn't make them feel normal. There's an adage that I find kind of interesting, which is that normal people, quote unquote, often want to feel special, but people who often fit into this group of being special desperately want to be perceived as normal or part of the crowd. And this is something that, I want you to think about when you're planning your lessons or when you're, more realistically, taking lesson plans from other teachers and trying to fit, a million things in a really short time period. So there are different ways of doing inclusion in your curriculum. So you can do it subtly, which is you can, highlight individuals who are part of a diverse community and the work that they have done. I guarantee you, whatever old dead white guy you are teaching about, there is probably somebody else doing that work who is not an old dead cis straight white man. And no shade to Shakespeare, he was a really good author, but there are other people you can teach in addition to, some of the great classics that we're so accustomed to including in our curriculum. And something I'm going to talk about later actually is some of those great classics actually have examples of people who are part of the queer community in there. We just don't talk about that aspect of their life for reasons I'm sure you can gather or estimate. So in some cases, we want you we suggest that you highlight individuals and their work without getting into great detail about their actual identity or how that might have influenced their work. In other situations, you might be more able to do this in an overt way. So you might be able to introduce and discuss topics like gender and sexuality specifically, have these topics be themes that you're addressing in your arts-based courses. And we're going to talk about an example of how to do that right now. So the example that I have put in here is James Baldwin, who is someone who I really respect and really enjoy reading the work of. If you don't know, James Baldwin is a writer. He wrote pieces that reflected the social climate of the United States of America during the Civil Rights Movement. I've chosen James Baldwin because he's kind of a secondary figure in the Civil Rights Movement, and I know that's American history, but I do think that, there's not a history class in the world that isn't going to talk about civil rights or going to talk about Black Lives Matter and Martin Luther King Jr. So this is the example that I've chosen for this. So James Baldwin wrote pieces that reflected the social climate of the United States. He worked closely with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, both of whom are people we already study in history. Now, something that not everyone knows is that James Baldwin was queer. He did specifically write about his queerness as well. His written work highlights themes of sexuality, queer sexuality, the controversy of being a queer person and also a Black man, the complications inherent in being in those two communities and not really fitting like you feel in either one. There are so many things that are fascinating that this man writes about that you can tap into. But there are also lots and lots of things he wrote about that weren't about the fact that he was gay or the fact that he was part of the queer community. So, whatever you choose to study, you can incorporate this man in what you're doing. When you integrate him in a unit of study, you're normalizing the inclusion of queer people and queer work. And in this case, queer Black people, which I think is really important as well. So I have this kind of stoplight methodology of thinking about ways that you can teach inclusion depending on the context of the classroom, the school, the board that you are eventually working in. So if you think of this as like a red light or your most restrictive scenario, red light is you just mention James Baldwin and you tell people that, they can wiki him. You say something very, very straightforward like Martin Luther King Jr. had a number of contemporaries who participated in the civil rights movement, including James Baldwin and Bayard Rustin. Both of those are gay men who worked with closely with Martin Luther King Jr. And if that's all you say, then that's all you can say. And, I think we have to be real that sometimes, that is what we're going to do. But I also think we have to be realistic about, the context of teaching and working and, being people in the 21st century in a gig economy, right? Like, obviously you can't teach inclusively if you can't keep your job. So I don't want you to think necessarily that, doing the red light version of this inclusion is bad or not good enough. You are the person who is going to be able to arbiter within your own context what you can and can't do with the students that you are teaching, in a given time or a given situation. But we're also going to talk about how you can work that in other situations where you might have an opportunity to be a little bit more specifically open and inclusive. So this kind of middle of the road situation, and I'm very intentionally providing different media examples when we talk about ways you can incorporate this into your curriculum, because I know not everybody teaches the same style or has the same interest in terms of what you're providing your students for enrichment. So our yellow light, or our medium inclusion option, if you will, is I Am Not Your Negro, which is a documentary that you can watch with your students. It explores the civil rights movement through James Baldwin's friendships with Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, etc. And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at the civil rights movement, because it's very personal. It's very much about his relationship with these other people. As a person who did history, obviously I'm super biased. I love doing social history. I love learning about relationships. I love telling stories. So of course, this is something that I would recommend in terms of teaching. Because it's a contemporary documentary, I believe it came out in 2019, it does make connections to the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's that social tie-in, that modern tie-in. And there is like a blink and you'll miss it moment in this documentary that mentions James Baldwin's sexuality, because it's one of the reasons that he was being followed by the FBI, but they don't discuss it at length. So this is another situation where you can sort of bring it up and you can see what happens, and you can potentially engage with it as part of, you know, how that might have impacted James Baldwin, or how that might have impacted the civil rights movement. But you also don't have to go into it if that's not something you're interested in, not something your students are interested in, or not something that is safe for you to, you know, engage with in a particular climate. Now, if you are teaching AP English and you're teaching in, I rag on Toronto, but if you're teaching in a very progressive district like the Toronto District School Board, you might teach something like this. So you might research Go the Way Your Blood Beats, which is an interview with James Baldwin. It's out of this book here called James Baldwin, The Last Interview, which is a collection of interviews from the end of Baldwin's life. And it's one of the few times that he discusses his sexuality at any great length. It's about a 10-page interview in this book. The title of the chapter, or the interview, I guess, is Go the Way Your Blood Beats. And it very specifically discusses the interplay between sexuality and the movement for Black rights. And I think intersectionality is a fascinating topic. And I think it's something that youth, particularly, 15 to 19, really instinctively understand. It's something that they really, they can really engage with. This idea of identity is crucially important at that age. And it gives you an opportunity to talk about how your identity impacts the things you care about, or the things that you want to work on, the changes you want to see in the world. So this is another example of a situation where you can go at great length and delve into topics like sexuality, racism, civil rights, that kind of thing. So now we're at the part of the presentation that I think is probably going to be the most exciting, depending on what your teachable subjects are. I have composed a list of things you can look up based on various art subjects that we teach in mostly in the province of Ontario, but applicable elsewhere too. Artists who were part of the queer community, and many of whom specifically addressed LGBTQ themes as part of the work that they were doing. So, for English, I encourage you to take a screenshot or something if any of these are of interest to you. So in English language arts, lots of the old guard of people we study in English were actually part of the queer community. So Emily Dickinson is widely believed by scholars to have been a lesbian. Tennessee Williams, Walt Whitman, Oscar Wilde, everybody knows Oscar Wilde, famously a bisexual man. Audre Lorde, Virginia Woolf, Alice Walker, Langston Hughes. These are all, very traditional. You would have no problem getting approved to teach these people in your English class, because they're well-established authors, writers, poets, that kind of thing. I've also put a couple of Canadian highlights in there. Catherine Hernandez, contemporarily Vivek Shraya is really excellent. Kason Sharp is also a really awesome poet you can look up and engage with. If you're looking for works you could study specifically, The Color Purple is a classic. Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe is a more contemporary, middle high school grade book. that I think a lot of kids would really enjoy reading. And it, you know, has these a lot of issues of different kinds of diversity in the plot of that book. I just would recommend it as a book study for high school. I think it's a great book. And there's also They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. And if none of that speaks to you, you can just Google things like LGBT English or LGBT curriculum. There are lots and lots of organizations around the world that have put together lesson plans, very specific lesson plans, even at particular ages, where you could talk about stuff like this. One book that's not mentioned on this slide, but I'm going to mention it right now because I'm studying it with a grade 8 class, is a book called The 57 Bus, which is about an incident in the United States, where a Black student assaulted a gender fluid student on a public bus. And so it's a really fascinating book to dive into. It talks about things like juvenile delinquency, youth justice, racism, discrimination based on sexuality and gender presentation. And I was really impressed. The school that I was working with was teaching this with grade 8 students. And was, you know, receiving rave reviews. And I've been having a great time meeting with the students at this school to talk about, you know, how they feel about this book. So that's my English language arts slide. Social studies. So if you have ever heard of the bystander effect, the textbook example we use for the bystander effect, which is that principle in anthropology, sociology, where we talk about people will not engage in a situation where something bad is happening if they are not specifically instructed. So like responsibility is diffused the greater the number of people who are present in an issue, which is why if you've ever taken you know, St. John's ambulance training, they tell you, like, one of the first things they tell you is that you have to specifically speak directly to people and say, you know, person in the red shirt, you're going to call the police, you're going to do this, you're going to sit here, because otherwise nothing's going to get done. So the textbook example we use for that is a woman named Katie Genovese. And Katie Genovese is a New York woman who allegedly was murdered outside her apartment in the hearing of, you know, 50 to 100 people. And she was lesbian, and we never talk about this. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that she was queer. I think that was a really significant part of her experience, and also a really significant part of what happened to her. There's a really great documentary about it on Netflix you should maybe consider watching. Harvey Milk, we've heard of this one for sure. It's a great opportunity to watch a movie in class if you want. Stonewall, the Canadian equivalent of Stonewall is called Operation Soap. You can engage in stuff like that if you want. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. The Compton cafeteria riots are another American example. I've given this presentation at conferences in a couple of different contexts, and regrettably, American history is the one that kind of resonates with people regardless of where they're teaching. So a lot of my examples here are American. But the CCGSD also has resources specifically for history related to queer history in Canada that's actually broken down by province. So if that's of interest to you, you should Google us, or there's a link at the end of the slide deck that'll tell you what our website is. And we have video lessons of queer history in Canada that you can just, I mean, you can't steal them, but you can absolutely download them and use them however you like. Something that I think is really interesting in terms of geography or other, which I think is a topic people wouldn't normally associate with being able to teach diversity, but you can talk about diaspora, you can talk about, you can use Equaldex, which is a really great website that shows atlases all around the world based on equity. So it produces maps on things based like on countries where it's illegal to be homosexual, countries where it's illegal for homosexual people to adopt children, countries where you are legally allowed to transition, or you are only legally allowed to transition if you sterilize yourself. So it just like, it has, there's a lot of maps you can work with in a way that I think is really interesting. People have been following American politics, the Trump impeachment, LGBT protection under the Supreme Court has been a really serious thing in the media recently. I don't know if you've been following it. If you have, I urge you to look it up. Chase Strangio is I think he's 21-year-old lawyer in the States who is also a trans man who is fighting on the front lines, if you will, for LGBT protection under the Supreme Court. LGBT protection in Canadian law is pretty robust. I think it would be a great thing to study in high school law if that's something you're teaching. David Reimer is, he and his brother are kind of a famous example of psychology. They're often brought up in discussions of nature versus nurture debate because he and his twin brother were, for complicated reasons that I won't get into, they were both assigned male at birth, but David was raised as a woman. And so they're kind of widely used as like the case study for whether or not gender is a nature or nurture thing. And this happened in Canada. There's also Queer There and Everywhere, which is just, you know, a nice little book. I have my copy here. It's like 1 to 2 pages on a variety of historical figures who arguably were part of the LGBTQ community. Really great kind of thing where you could sort of say, here's a list of 24 people, you pick one of the people out of this book and do a project on them. And finally, I want to mention zines. I think zines are a lot of untapped potential in high school. So zines are magazines that are made not really for mass production. They come out of community activism. And you can really make a zine on whatever topic you want. Zines are great. We have a workshop at the CCGSD that can be taught in either in history or in art about what zines are and how to make them. You can also, you know, bring some examples. I have some on my desk. They're really easy to find. They're a really great opportunity for students to express themselves. Just generally speaking, I think zines are great. And you can get them on pretty much any topic. Drama. So once again, we've got Oscar Wilde and Tennessee Williams here. If you're looking for more specific pieces to study, high school kids love Rent. They are obsessed with Rent. Angels in America is a classic of American theater. Twelfth Night, Victor Victoria. Most students even know this story already because they might have studied Twelfth Night in 7th or 8th grade. It sometimes comes around. The Laramie Project is a really interesting play that you can study about. It's about a hate crime that happened in the States to a man called Matthew Shepard. And it's just a really interesting play. I would recommend looking it up if drama is kind of a thing you're into. And I think there's actually a movie version of it if you're lazy and don't want to read the script. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Streetcar Named Desire, Bear, Normal Heart. These are all like critically acclaimed pieces of theater. I think you would, you know, it would be relatively easy for you to justify the inclusion of this kind of thing. And of course, The Color Purple. Visual arts. So again, we've got a lot of classic artists here who you could include who are part of the queer community. So Frida Kahlo, Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe is the, you know, all of the paintings of flowers. Diane Arbus, who's a photographer. Annie Leibovitz is a very famous photographer who is part of the queer community. Andy Warhol, Basquiat. Grant Wood. Grant Wood is the painter of this American Gothic painting, which I think everyone has seen, and no one knows that the artist who made the most straight painting I've ever seen in my life is part of the queer community. I also want to highlight some Canadian options. So there's Paul Wong, Andrew Moncrief, and Kent Monkman is a particularly interesting painter and artist who really controversial. Definitely not an artist you would want to study in a sort of red light situation, but very provocative, very interesting work that really interacts with Canadian history and has some very critical commentary on the nature of relationships between the state and Indigenous people, especially Indigenous people who are also queer. I think this is my final example, music. So I was making this slide deck updating this slide deck a couple of weeks ago, and I was trying to figure out how old the people in Teachers College are right now so I could give you appropriate examples of musicians, and I don't know if I succeeded. But whether you want to teach music from that super traditional perspective, there are examples of people like very historically well-respected composers like George Handel, Pyotr Tchaikovsky. Both of these are people who were it's very well documented that they had relationships with other men. The frontman for Judas Priest very famously is gay. Lou Reed, who made the Velvet Underground, also very famously engaged in a lot of queer relationships. I don't know if you still resonate with the 80s, but Freddie Mercury, David Bowie, lots of people in that era of music who, were gender nonconforming. Glam rock is a fascinating period of musical history to study. And there's a lot of contemporary musicians who are part of the 2S LGBTQ community as well. So some of the Canadian ones that I want to highlight are Cœur de Pirate, which is also great if you end up teaching in a French or a bilingual district. Peaches, Tegan and Sarah, Ray Spoon, and Kate Reed. I've also put some pictures on the slide here of some contemporary artists who are openly part of the queer community. So we've got Janelle Monáe, Laura Jane Grace, who is the lead singer of Against Me, Haley Kiyoko, and of course, Lil Nas. So it was really important to me that I leave a lot of time in this workshop for discussion, because my ability to give you specific recommendations for any given school board is basically nothing. I am not an expert in every school board in the province of Ontario, nor am I an expert in every school board in the country of Canada. So what I do think is valuable is using this opportunity for us to speak together and talk about experiences that you've had, especially if you've had a practicum already, if you've had a placement in, a conservative school board or an open school board, whatever, your experiences might be or your opinions might be. I really just wanted to create an opportunity for us to speak and discuss. So of course, we have the chat open. Natalie is going to be monitoring that. I can also see it because I'm privileged to have two screens here. I'm going to put this slide up that has my contact and the CCGSD resources on it, because I think it's really important that you get that information down if that's of interest to you. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening. I hope we're going to have an interesting conversation together over the next 20 minutes to a half an hour.
So a question came in while you were speaking about the red, yellow, and green kind of light districts that you have kind of categorized. So what are some ways that we can kind of tell what light district we might be teaching in? And then within Ontario districts, what can happen if we teach outside of kind of what the board is specifically open to or okay with us talking about?
So those are really interesting questions. I think there's a couple of different ways that you can sort of interpret the context of the place that you are teaching at. You can talk to, your colleagues at your new place of work. You can see what they're teaching. You can ask them, what topics have you had success with? You can ask them, is the administration interest, is the administration open to new ideas? Is the administration really interested in keeping a low profile? These are things that you're going to figure out just through the climate of existing in a school. I don't think you're going to have to push very hard to find answers to those questions. And whether or not you want to be rocking the boat is a very personal choice, a very personal question. Some people are a lot more comfortable with it than others. Some of my very close friends are teachers, and I know some of them are very, very strict about what they're posting online, and the kind of I don't know, the trail that follows them on the internet, or I understand the risks, but it really just depends on what you can pick up, what you can hear, who you can, make friends at your new school and ask them. You can, to a certain extent, use this question of, is there a GSA, as like a very, very introductory, I guess, barometer of how your school is feeling. There's no checklist of things that's going to tell you what school is inclusive and what school isn't, or what board is safe and what board isn't. I think you are going to have the skills to figure that stuff out pretty readily. In terms of what can actually happen, it's a complicated question. I mean, there's certainly curriculum in Ontario is relatively specific in terms of what you are allowed to speak about in particular age groups, with regards to sexuality, and to a lesser extent with regards to gender identity. That being said, you are not chained to the curriculum, right? I mean, obviously, any curriculum is going to give you more content than you could possibly teach in a semester. So you are already going to be picking and choosing what you are teaching. It's really more just a question of how families may react to the topics that you may choose to engage in, and whether or not the administration is going to support you in doing that. I don't know any examples of anyone who was successfully, legitimately reprimanded or lost their job for talking about LGBTQ stuff in class. That's probably a little bit different if you choose to work in the Catholic board, because you do have to sign a statement of faith as part of working in the Catholic board. You would absolutely have a case for wrongful termination if somebody did, terminate you for talking about identity, especially if you happen to be part of the queer community. There shouldn't be anything controversial about saying to your students, my partner who happens to be a woman or whatever. That being said, there's a lot, discrimination is insidious and it's tricky. It can happen in a lot of, social ways that are difficult to track. So I think, yeah, this is absolutely a risk. I'm going to be real. It's a risk you have to take. For some of us, for people who are part of the community, it's a risk we don't have a choice in taking if we want to live authentically. So I would encourage you, I assume a lot of you became teachers because you want to influence the future. You want to change the world. You want to make kids better and more open. So I encourage you to, whatever your capacity is, whatever your privilege is, I encourage you to push against your boundaries and, take a risk.
I have a question kind of going off of the parent reaction that you just mentioned. We've talked in a couple of my classes about sending home almost like a weekly, like next week's topics kind of thing. So would you recommend kind of like throwing that maybe in there so that parents have a heads up of what we're discussing? Or like, is that not necessarily needed in your experience? Like, what would you kind of give as advice in terms of that?
It's, honestly, it's different in every school. There's an enormous difference of, what visiting a school in Hawkesbury is like compared to visiting a school in North York. There are some schools that are very strict and have insisted that we need to send a letter home to parents to discuss this. Schools with high immigrant populations are sometimes a little more nervous about bringing up these topics than schools with a, generally speaking, more privileged demographic of students. It's not like we don't have a set letter that I can send you to send home. It's really up to the teacher or the school that you work with. I personally am not a fan of sending a letter home that says we're going to talk about this, because I think the people who really need to hear that information are going to get pulled out of that class if you tell them it's coming. But I also don't have to deal with parent feedback in the exact same way as someone who is contractually teaching at a school. So it's, of course it is a little bit easier for me to say that. I really do think your colleagues at wherever you are teaching are going to be your biggest sources of information on something like this. You can sort of say to them, because teachers, your students, right? The context of what's going on in their lives. Even in really big schools, you often have, at least a decent handle on kids who might have a difficult situation at home. And so you can touch base with these other people or with the counselors at your school and say, do we have a policy on this? Are we supposed to send home a letter when we talk about sensitive or controversial topics? Or do we just do it and then, ask forgiveness if necessary? Like it's really up to you, I guess.
Awesome, thank you. Taylor asked if you could just repeat the name about who discusses the window mirror theory. She'd like to look a little bit more into it.
Yeah, that's Emily Style. So Style like fashion, Style. And I believe she published that in 1996.
Perfect. And then Annette would like to know, could you explain a little bit more about how you would implement the more subtle integration of to LGBTQ writing, and how much of an intro would you necessarily give about the author's life if you're doing a little bit of a more subtle integration?
How much of an explanation of any author's life do you give when you're teaching? Because my understanding, when I took English, when I took high school English and AP English and all that stuff, there was one teacher who really made a point of talking about the author and their context and where they were living and who their relationships were and how that might have informed their work. Some English teachers take the approach of the author is dead, right? And it doesn't matter what their context is or what their situation is. I will say it's going to be weird if you do a detailed introduction for an LGBTQ writer and not for any other writer. I think that goes back to sort of the idea of tokenization versus normalization. If you regularly are doing contextual descriptions of the authors that you were studying in terms of, you know, what their life is, or things that they cared about, or things that we know or don't know about their lives, then it is appropriate for you to do that for 2S LGBTQ writers. It's weird and inconsistent if you only do that for the writers you were including for, you know, token inclusivity, but not for authors who we just sort of take their background for granted.
Great. And then Emily would like to know if there's a more correct acronym to use. So a session earlier this week used LGBT2Q plus, and you've used today 2LGBTQ. So we just want to make sure that we're using the appropriate terminology.
I totally hear you. There is not a standard acronym. There is not a widely accepted or, you know, universal acronym. We do not have a big gay parliament where we agreed that this was the acronym we were going to use over other acronyms. I can tell you that the reason that I personally use 2S at the beginning is because a very close mentor to me said to me that it was a very simple thing I could do to fight against the idea that people who are not Indigenous come last, right? Or people who are Indigenous come last at the acronym. So a lot of people put the 2 at the end of the acronym. And one of my mentors said, you know, I always put us first. I put my people first. And I was like, would it, you know, be meaningful to you if I did that? And they said, yes. So that's just what I do. I will say that when I teach, like if you were to invite me into your workshop, into your classroom to do a workshop on gender and sexuality, I do not teach the acronym, because there is no standard acronym, because the further we get from binary genders and sort of boxy understandings of the universe, the less the acronym makes sense. I as a trans person don't identify as a man or a woman. So what does the word lesbian mean in that context? I don't know. My partner and I don't know. The person I'm married to and I have difficulty describing our relationship to people because there isn't really a word for that. And I personally think that, you know, the terminology is shifting to reflect that. I think we're talking more about these concepts of gender identity, gender expression, attraction, more so than these specific, you know, LGBTQ2IAPQ. There are lots and lots of letters you could put in there if you want. I think people are going to be able to tell if your intentions are good or if you're knowledgeable, regardless of what acronym you're using, although I totally appreciate that it's nice to have a specific word that you know is the right one to use.
Awesome. And then Taylor had another question. Do you know if there are or will be in the future any student or teacher candidate opportunities at CCGSD to put towards, we have like an alternative field experience. So do you know if there would be any opportunities for us to work with you guys?
I really appreciate that question, and I would love for you to email me about it. I think realistically in 2021 to 2022, no, but in 2022 to 2023, possibly. We're doing a really significant restructuring at the CCGSD right now. We're going to be paring down our staff. We're changing our programming. So this particular fiscal year would be a bad year to ask for that. Next year, I would love to have you come and do workshops with me. I do actually have a student who is on placement who attended this lecture today, whose name is Griffin, but they are a placement student in social work, not in Ontario education. So we probably have to discuss like how many hours you needed or whatever, but in general, yeah, I would love a placement student. Sure, come send me an email. My email's on the slide. But unfortunately, just financially and in terms of how many hours I will be working in the next fiscal year, not this year.
Awesome. And then Alyssa was asking, what are some suggestions for how we can combat heteronormativity in our classrooms other than creating inclusive curriculums?
Other than creating inclusive curriculums? Well, so I think there's general things you can do to sort of push up against the concept of heteronormativity. I think neutrality of language is a big thing that people are thinking about now. You know, I used to, before I worked for the CCGSD, I did this training in professional context, and so I would talk to people about things like, you know, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. I used to do trainings like this in corporate settings, and I would talk about things like the importance of asking people open-ended questions. So when you meet, like if you meet somebody at a party, don't ask them, oh, is this your boyfriend? Like, why are you assuming that they're straight? Why are you assuming they have a boyfriend? Why don't you just say, who did you come with today, if anyone? And if you have, so make sure you're asking open-ended questions. Provide students the opportunity to share information about the pronouns they use or the identity that they use. You know, I really encourage teachers to give out a survey at the beginning of the semester that touches on some of these things. So things like, you know, what is your name on the class list versus what name do you want me to call you in class? What pronouns do you use? Can I use this information freely with your parents? Can I use it with other teachers? Is it just between you and me? You know, you have to give students the opportunity to give you information about themselves that will inform how you're teaching. I also encourage you to just switch up some of the like basic examples that you're using. You know, everybody has had those math problems that have like the token ethnic name in there where it's like, you know, Billy, Bobby, Susie, and Dimitri all go to the store, and you're like, okay. You know, if you're talking about situations like that, you can also flip up the relationship with people. Try not to make assumptions that everybody is living at home with one mom and one dad. A lot of it really has to do with like how you communicate with people socially, is just trying to avoid assumptions. And when you do that, people notice. Very quickly, one of the anecdotes that I really like to tell is I spent a year training doctors on how to do 2S LGBTQ inclusive care. And one of the doctors told me, she sent me an email like months after I had trained her, and she said, you know, this little old man came into my office, and he, you know, I've been seeing him for years, and I had changed the way that I started asking questions because of the training that you were doing. And I've been seeing him for, I think she said 8 years, and he came out to me as a gay man because he noticed the way that I had changed how I was talking about partner instead of you know, making assumptions about who he was related to, or if he was married, or what kind of sexual behavior he was engaging in. Kids are really, really perceptive. They will notice when you're making an effort to do stuff like that. That being said, dismantling heteronormativity, like in the whole world, is an enormous thing. I don't have a top 10 tips for disrupting heteronormativity, but those are some of my thoughts in, you know, 2 minutes.
Awesome. And then Taylor shared a couple of other ideas in the chat. If anybody hadn't seen those, you can take a look. Just like avoiding gendered language, modeling your use of pronouns, kind of things that Eliot's already talked about, but a couple other ideas. Annette would like to know, do you have any information or experience with teaching about two-spirited individuals in Indigenous culture? Are there ways that we could integrate that maybe into social studies or history, or kind of any advice that you have for that?
Yeah, I'm a really, really, really big fan when we're talking about any marginalized community, letting those marginalized communities speak their own truth and their words. So there are loads of Two-Spirit people who, you know, have spoken in documentaries or have YouTube channels or whatever that you can look up and use. One video that I really like is this video of a person named James McCocus, who is a doctor in Alberta. It might be Saskatchewan, but I think it's Alberta. And he is a Two-Spirit person who works with underprivileged youth in the prairies, especially with queer youth in the prairies, which is a huge deal. And there's like an 8-minute video where Al Jazeera interviews them and talks about the work that they do, and that, you know, some of the parents of children speak about how important it is that the children have a diverse doctor and that kind of thing. And James McCocus is an interesting one to pick because that person has an active Twitter account. They were on The Amazing Race, which I know is probably not a thing that Gen Z cares about, but they were on, you know, like a what's the word, a reality TV show. I think they won, actually. I think they and their partner won The Amazing Race Canada. So they're kind of a name that has some like recognition. There's also when we're talking about Indigenous culture, you can study Two-Spirit people kind of around the world. Like Two-Spirit is typically a word that we use to refer to an identity specific to what we would call North America, but there are diverse gender expressions around the world. So The Fa'afafine, for example, are something you could study. A group of people you could study. There's a documentary by PBS called Two-Spirit that you can watch, for free online, because it's a PBS documentary about Two-Spirit people around the world. So there's lots and lots of things out there. I would say for any marginalized group like that, I really prefer as much as possible to watch interviews with people who are part of that community, to really give them the opportunity to speak about their own identity. It's really not my place as a white person to explain what Two-Spirit means. I do my best to sort of defer to experts of their own experience, in the same way that I would hope that people who are not trans would defer to me when they want to talk about what it means to be a trans person.
Awesome. Sorry, what did you say that documentary was called?
It's just called Two-Spirit.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Trigger warning for that documentary, though, because it's got a murder in it. So
okay.
Yeah.
Good to know. So Amanda would like to know, do you have any tips for maybe younger primary grades, especially because they're just kind of starting to realize that everyone's maybe not the exact same, has the exact same home life? What are some things that maybe you would have wanted a teacher to do when you were younger? Just any advice?
So young kids are my favorite to visit, to tell you the truth. It is the best part of my job, is visiting kids in primary grades. There is an absolutely phenomenal selection of diverse kids books out there now. I would strongly encourage you to look at, getting some of these. Our favorite one right now is called Intersectionalities, and it discusses the concept of intersectionality from kindergarten to grade 6, and they actually published a teaching guide for this book that you can buy, that has lesson plans for every like grade level. It is American focused, but I think you can sort of extrapolate to Canada. So the book, I'm going to put it in the chat, is called Intersectionalities. Yeah, and it's beautiful, it's colorful, it's rhyming, and it's a book that introduces the concept of, we're all different, but it's important that we try and help each other. So it talks about race, it talks about gender, it talks about immigrant families, it talks about socioeconomic status, it talks about diverse families. Like it does it all. It's amazing. They did not pay me to say this, but I love this book. So that's one of my favorite things to recommend for younger folks. And I think we do have workshops for younger folks. So if you know somebody who is a teacher in younger grades, we have activities that we do. One of the ones that is my favorite to run, although we can't really do it in COVID, is it's a series of flashcards where you show kindergartners pictures of gendered toys, and then you ask them if it's for boys or for girls. And then at the end, you have a discussion about, what does it mean if something is for boys or it's for girls? What does it mean if you like something that's not for your gender, supposedly, right? Like, kids at a really young age have very strong opinions about these sort of things. But the reason I love working with them is because their questions about that are just as sincere as their questions about what my favorite color is, and that's very refreshing.
Awesome, that's a great resource. Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions come through. Does anybody have any other questions to ask? We've got a couple more minutes.
Does anybody want to tell me what a good job I did? If you do have feedback about the workshop, that's great. We would love, this is the work that we do. So it's important to know that it's actually helpful and meaningful. I was being very flippant there, but.
No, a lot of, I don't know if you saw it in the chat box too, a lot of people said these were great resources, like awesome to have. So thank you.
Someone said no shade to Shakespeare.
Awesome. Okay, well, I will thank you then. We'll end the session. Thank you so much for your time and sharing all these amazing resources with us. Your email's up on the screen. If anybody had any other questions, are you okay with us just sending you an email?
Absolutely. Send me an email. I really want to plug our newsletter too. I know you only have like temporary student emails, but you might want to consider signing up for it because it'll talk about things that our organization is doing. And I'm looking to publish a newsletter specifically for teachers starting this year. So I'm going to be sharing resources, blogging about my experiences, kind of thing. So if you get on the regular newsletter, then you'll know when my newsletter starts, and it'll be really cool. We also have loads of resources on our website. So we have posters and things you can teach on. You can get the links to our history programming there, which is, again, our history programming is unbelievable. It's available in English and French. It's all pre-recorded videos. So you just, throw it on and work with it. There's teaching guides from the person who made the program. There's lots and lots of information on our website. So I just want to plug that really hard before I disappear. But yes, please email me anytime.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for your time today. Everybody have a great last 2 sessions of conference week, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Catch you later.